Welcome to the world of science fiction stories, and don't forget to share and subscribe the channel. The galaxy was a vast and unyielding place, a place where power dictated everything. The Galactic Council, a united group of the most advanced and powerful alien species in the universe, held dominion over countless worlds, including Earth. The Council had been observing Earth for centuries, noting its rapid advancements, its potential, but most of all, its defiance. For years, humanity had kept its distance from the rest of the galaxy, choosing to stay isolated in their small corner of the universe, content with their own affairs. But now the time had come to change that. The message came unexpectedly, an encrypted transmission from the Galactic Council. Earth's leaders had been summoned to a conference, a meeting where the future of the human race would be decided. The transmission contained a simple demand: Earth must pay tribute, a payment required by the Council for its continued existence. The specifics of this tribute were vague, but the tone was clear: refuse and there would be consequences. On Earth, the leaders were caught off guard. The demand was absurd to them. They had always known there were other species out there, but they had never expected such a direct confrontation. The President of the United Nations called an emergency session, bringing together the most powerful nations and the brightest minds on the planet to discuss the matter. The world was thrown into chaos as news of the Council's demand spread across the globe. The Council's message, delivered with an air of unassailable authority, was blunt. Your world has been observed long enough. Your advancements, your growing influence have not gone unnoticed. You will now contribute or face the consequences. The leaders gathered in a secure bunker, the room tense and thick with the weight of uncertainty. It was an unprecedented moment in human history. Never before had Earth faced such a threat from beyond the stars. The room was filled with military leaders, scientists, and diplomats, all scrambling for solutions. They had no knowledge of the true power the Galactic Council wielded. No one knew if Earth could survive such a confrontation. The world's response was divided. Some argued that they should comply. After all, the Council's power was undeniable, and it would be foolish to provoke a war with an enemy so far beyond their reach. Others, however, refused to consider surrender. Earth had fought for its independence before, and they had always come out victorious. The Council may have had their advanced technology, but humanity had one thing the aliens did not: determination. As the debates raged on, a quiet figure stood at the back of the room. General Elizabeth Grant, the commander of Earth's elite defense forces, watched as the debate intensified. She had always been a firm believer in diplomacy and in finding a peaceful solution, but this time was different. This time she wasn't sure there would be a peaceful solution. The demand was too direct, too final. Earth couldn't just back down, not now. With a deep sigh, she stepped forward, catching the attention of everyone in the room. Her voice, calm but unwavering, cut through the noise. We don't know the full extent of their power, but we cannot simply bow to them. If we do, we risk losing everything that makes us human. The room fell silent. The eyes of the world's most powerful leaders were on her now. But General, one of the diplomats said, his voice shaking with fear, we have no idea what they're capable of. We're not prepared for this. How do we know we won't be wiped out with a single wave of their hand? General Grant's gaze hardened. We don't know, but I do know one thing. We've always found a way to survive. We fight, we adapt, we find a solution, no matter how impossible it seems. The room remained still, the weight of her words sinking in. The fate of the world rested in their hands, and the decisions made in the coming hours would determine whether humanity would survive or fall to the power of the Galactic Council. The president, a man whose face had grown pale as the debate continued, cleared his throat. What are you suggesting, General? She paused for a moment, gathering her thoughts. We need to prepare for war. We need to show them that we are not afraid to fight, but we also need to show them that we're not stupid. We can't just blindly rush into battle. We need to gather information, understand their weaknesses, and then make our move. Another voice spoke up from the back. It was Dr. Marcus Ellis, one of Earth's leading scientists, a man known for his work on advanced space technology. I agree with the General. We need to know what we're up against before making any rash decisions, but we also need to prepare for the worst. If we don't, we may not live to regret it. The room fell into a deep silence as the reality of their situation settled in. There was no easy way out. They could not simply ignore the Galactic Council's demand. Refusing them could mean the end of Earth, but surrendering meant they would lose their freedom, their identity, and their future. There was no easy choice, and every decision carried weight. As the meeting continued late into the night, the world's leaders agreed on a course of action. They would begin preparing for war, but they would also seek out every possible way to gather intelligence on the Galactic Council. It was a fragile hope, a hope that one day they would find a way to outsmart the Council, or at the very least, stand a fighting chance. But as the meeting drew to a close and the leaders left the room, General Grant stood alone for a moment. She gazed out the window, looking at the stars. Somewhere out there, the Galactic Council was waiting, and they were ready to make their move. Humanity's survival now rested on the choices they would make in the coming days. Would they bow to the power of the Council, or would they fight back? The future was uncertain, and the stakes had never been higher. The world was in turmoil as the decision was made to prepare for what could very well be the greatest conflict humanity had ever faced. People from all corners of the globe could feel the weight of the moment. News outlets blared reports of the Galactic Council's demands, while the government scrambled to assemble the necessary resources for the defense of Earth. Behind closed doors, Earth's military leaders and the world's top scientists were hard at work, trying to figure out how to survive against an enemy with the power to reshape the galaxy at their will. General Elizabeth Grant was tasked with leading the charge. She had fought in wars before, but nothing like this, nothing even close. This wasn't just about defending borders or resources. This was about humanity's very existence. The Council wasn't asking for tribute in the form of goods or technology. They were demanding that Earth submit to their will. The very thought of surrendering to them felt wrong. Humanity had fought too hard, come too far to just give up. But how could they possibly stand a chance? Grant's mind raced as she stood in the war room, looking at the large map of the world. Every nation was represented by blinking lights, tracking the military assets that had been mobilized. She ran her fingers through her short, dark hair, feeling the pressure of the moment weighing heavily on her shoulders. "We're going to need every ally we can get," she muttered under her breath, half to herself. "We can't do this alone." Her thoughts were interrupted when Dr. Marcus Ellis, the scientist who had been leading the research into alien technology, entered the room. He looked tired, his face drawn with the exhaustion of long hours in the lab, but his eyes were sharp, filled with determination. "General, I've been analyzing the data," Dr. Ellis began, his voice steady. "We've been able to decrypt some of the information from their transmissions. It's not much, but it's a start." Grant nodded, motioning for him to continue. "We've identified several key technologies that we might be able to reverse engineer, though it's going to take time," Ellis explained. "Their ships, for example, are unlike anything we've ever seen. But there's a possibility we could learn how they operate, how to fight them. If we get it right, we may be able to even the odds." "Even the odds?" Grant repeated, her voice laced with skepticism. "Against beings who have been traversing the stars for millennia, I'm not so sure about that." Ellis looked her in the eye. "I'm not saying it'll be easy, but if we don't try, then what choice do we have? Do we just sit back and let them destroy us? We need to make a stand." Grant let out a long breath. She knew he was right. They had no other choice but to try. The alternative was too terrible to imagine. Meanwhile, the rest of the world's leaders were in constant communication. The situation was tense, each nation wondering how they could contribute to the defense of Earth. But with every passing day, it became more apparent that this wasn't just a war for survival. It was a fight for humanity's place in the galaxy. Nations that had once been rivals were now coming together, their differences set aside in the face of the existential threat posed by the Galactic Council. Yet even as they united, they struggled to coordinate. Every country had its own priorities, its own military strategies, and its own way of doing things. Yet in the end, they all realized that the only way to survive was to work together. The world's armies were mobilizing, and every resource was being funneled into this single, impossible goal, finding a way to fight back. The skies above Earth were silent. For the first time in history, humanity wasn't looking to the stars with hope or curiosity. They were looking at them with fear. The Galactic Council's fleets were still out there, just beyond the reach of Earth sensors, watching and waiting. The silence was ominous, heavy with the sense of impending doom. Despite the fear, there was a growing sense of determination among the human population. People from all walks of life, from soldiers to scientists to everyday citizens, began preparing for what was to come. News of the Council's demand had sparked a fire in humanity's heart, and while many were still unsure of how to fight such a powerful enemy, the resolve to survive was unmistakable. In the streets, people were joining the military, volunteering for training and taking up arms. Scientists and engineers were working around the clock to develop new technologies, from weapons to spacecraft, all designed to give Earth a fighting chance. The world was coming together in a way it never had before. It was as if the entire planet had been united by one singular purpose: survival. But even as hope was kindling in the hearts of humanity, there were still those who doubted. Some believed the Galactic Council's demand was too great, that no amount of preparation or ingenuity could save them from the inevitable. These voices were drowned out by the growing call for resistance, but their words still lingered in the minds of some. General Grant sat in her office, staring out at the horizon. The enormity of what lay ahead weighed heavily on her. She was a soldier, a commander, but even she couldn't deny that the odds seemed impossible. However, she had learned a long time ago that the impossible was often just the beginning. Humanity had faced impossible odds before and had emerged victorious. It wasn't just about strength. It was about heart, about courage, about the unyielding will to fight, no matter the cost. "This isn't over," she whispered to herself. "We're not done yet." In the coming days, Earth would prepare for the unknown. Every nation, every individual would be called upon to do their part. The stakes had never been higher, but neither had humanity's resolve. They would fight, they would adapt, and they would find a way to survive, no matter what the Galactic Council had planned. As the preparations continued, the calm before the storm lingered. The Council had made their demands, and now humanity had no choice but to rise to the challenge. The future of Earth rested in the hands of those who were ready to stand against the stars. The days that followed were filled with a tense anticipation that hung in the air like a storm waiting to break. General Grant spent her nights in the war room, poring over plans, simulations, and intelligence reports. Earth's best minds were working around the clock, racing against time to develop a strategy to face the overwhelming power of the Galactic Council. Every possible avenue was explored, from new weapons to advanced tactics. But the challenge was clear. Humanity was underprepared, under-resourced, and vastly outmatched by an enemy with technology far beyond their understanding. However, in the midst of these struggles, one thing became increasingly clear. Humanity was not going to back down without a fight. Every nation, every citizen had come to realize the magnitude of the situation. They knew that no single country could take on the Council alone, but together, perhaps there was a chance. As Grant reviewed the latest analysis of the enemy fleet, she couldn't shake the feeling that they were missing something, a key piece of the puzzle that could change everything. But what could it be? Across the globe, a quiet but determined resistance was growing. People who had once lived their lives without a second thought now found themselves taking part in a new reality, one where survival was the only goal. Training centers for the military were flooded with volunteers. People who had never picked up a weapon before were now being taught how to defend their homes and families. The energy of humanity's resolve could be felt everywhere, even in the most unlikely of places. Dr. Marcus Ellis, the scientist who had first identified the possibility of reverse engineering alien technology, continued to push forward in his work. He and his team had been working non-stop, deciphering every bit of data they could get their hands on. The research was slow, grueling, and filled with uncertainty. The information they were receiving was fragmented and cryptic, as if the Council had anticipated their every move, leaving only scraps for Earth's scientists to work with. Dr. Ellis refused to give up. He knew that they couldn't afford to stop now. He spent long hours in the lab, his mind constantly turning over new ideas and theories. He began experimenting with the alien tech they had acquired, slowly but surely discovering how it functioned. Though progress was painstakingly slow, Ellis was convinced that understanding the enemy's technology was their best chance. There had to be a way to fight back, a way to outsmart the Council using their own methods against them. Meanwhile, the political leaders of Earth were meeting in secret, attempting to coordinate a unified front. The weight of this responsibility fell heavily on their shoulders. Earth's leaders knew that they were no longer just fighting for their own nations, but for the entire planet. The world's divisions, once so glaring and insurmountable, were now irrelevant. Everyone was forced to work together, and in doing so, an uneasy sense of unity began to take shape. However, behind the scenes, not everyone was as hopeful. There were still those who questioned whether Earth's forces could ever stand a chance against the might of the Galactic Council. These doubts circulated quietly, lingering like a shadow in the minds of many. Despite the growing sense of uncertainty, there were moments of light. Earth's space fleets, though still largely unprepared, were coming together. Scientists were able to replicate some of the Council's technology, and engineers were designing new ships capable of standing up to the Council's devastating firepower. Yet with each step forward, there was always a nagging question: would it be enough? Could humanity's best efforts truly stand against a force that had already crushed countless civilizations before them? The people of Earth were watching, waiting. News outlets broadcast the most up-to-date developments, fueling a sense of shared purpose and anxiety. On the streets, in homes, and in classrooms, there was no escaping the reality of the situation. Everyone knew what was at stake. Families held their breath as the countdown to the confrontation continued, knowing that their lives might change forever in the coming days. In private, General Grant pondered her options. She knew that time was running out. Earth's defenses, though improving, were still no match for the power the Council possessed. She had to make a decision soon, one that could either save humanity or doom them to extinction. But what would it take to shift the balance of power? Was there a secret weapon they hadn't yet discovered, or were they simply too small and weak to win this war? The pressure mounted with every passing day. The Galactic Council's ships were closing in. Their demand for tribute had been made, and Earth had refused. Now the only thing that remained was the inevitable confrontation. It was not a question of if, but when. How would humanity respond to the greatest challenge it had ever faced? Would they rise to the occasion and find a way to fight back, or would they be swallowed whole by the Council's overwhelming might? As the countdown continued, every man, woman, and child on Earth could feel the weight of the moment. It was a time of uncertainty, yes, but also a time of unity and strength. Humanity was preparing for war, whether they were ready or not. The future of the human race rested on the shoulders of those who refused to give in. There was no turning back now. The fight for Earth's survival was about to begin, and it was a fight that would change everything. As the days grew shorter and the tension mounted, the pressure on General Grant and her team only intensified. In every corner of the planet there were whispers of the coming war. Families gathered, not knowing whether they would see another dawn, while leaders of nations convened, still unsure of how to face an enemy whose power far surpassed anything Earth had ever seen. The military, though gathering strength, could sense the enormous challenge that lay ahead. Despite all their advancements and preparations, there was a growing sense of doubt. Could humanity really stand up to the might of the Galactic Council? General Grant, despite the weight on her shoulders, never showed her doubts. She had trained for moments like this, and her resolve was unwavering, but even she could not ignore the growing sense of unease. As the leader of Earth's forces, she knew that every decision she made would affect the lives of billions. She knew she had to act, but she was faced with a difficult choice: charge into battle with what little they had, or wait, hoping that a breakthrough would come in time. Time, however, was running out. Dr. Marcus Ellis, the brilliant scientist who had become the face of Earth's resistance, was working tirelessly with his team. The alien technology they had gathered was both a blessing and a curse. Every piece of it offered hope, but also frustration. Every step forward seemed to come with a new challenge. Still, Ellis and his team refused to give in. They knew that this was humanity's last chance. If they could unlock the secrets of the alien tech, they could level the playing field, perhaps even give Earth a fighting chance. But it was a race against time. Despite their best efforts, Ellis's team had not yet found a solution. There was a growing sense of frustration in the lab. The pieces of the puzzle were scattered, and they had no idea how to put them together. They knew they needed to find a way to turn the tide, but the task seemed impossible. The threat of the Galactic Council loomed ever closer, and with every passing day the situation grew more dire. In the military command center, Grant stood in front of the massive screens displaying the latest fleet reports. The countdown to the Council's arrival was drawing nearer. Each report painted a grim picture of the enemy's strength. There was no escaping it. The time for planning was over. The time for action had arrived. But the question remained: how could they defeat an enemy that seemed invincible? How could humanity, with its limited resources and technology, stand a chance against a force that had already conquered countless other civilizations? Grant turned to her advisors, her mind racing for solutions. Every piece of information they had gathered suggested that the Galactic Council was nearly unstoppable. They were relentless, ruthless, and their technological superiority made them a nearly insurmountable foe. But even with all the odds stacked against them, Grant couldn't bring herself to surrender. She knew that Earth's only chance was to fight with everything they had. The tension in the room was palpable. No one spoke for a long moment, as if everyone was waiting for someone else to come up with an answer. Finally, it was Grant who broke the silence. "We will fight," she said firmly. "We will fight with everything we have. Our survival depends on it." Her words were met with silence, but there was no doubt in her mind. There was no turning back now. The decision had been made. Humanity's fight for survival had begun. As the military prepared for what was to come, the world waited in anxious anticipation. People across the globe were holding their breath, praying for a miracle, hoping that somehow, against all odds, Earth would prevail. Families embraced their loved ones, unsure of what the future would hold. The fear of the unknown was suffocating, but there was also a flicker of hope in the air, the kind of hope that only emerges in the darkest of times. The Earth was not ready. They were not prepared to face an enemy of this magnitude, but humanity's resilience was unmatched. With every challenge, they adapted. With every setback, they pushed forward. And in that determination, that sheer will to survive, they found their strength. The first battle would not be easy, and no one knew what would happen next. The Galactic Council was about to make its move, but humanity was ready. They would face the Council with everything they had, knowing that if they didn't fight now, they would lose everything. There would be no turning back. The final confrontation was imminent, and it would change everything. The skies above Earth had become a canvas for fear and uncertainty. As the countdown to the Council's arrival continued, the people on the ground could feel the tension like a weight pressing down on them. Every nation, every city, every person seemed to hold their breath, waiting for the storm to break. And it was clear now, the storm wasn't something that could be weathered easily. It was coming for them, and there was nowhere to run. In the command center, General Grant was deep in thought. Maps, reports, and the latest satellite imagery surrounded her. The sheer scale of the threat was overwhelming. The Galactic Council had dispatched their fleet, and Earth had only days before they arrived. The enemy ships were faster, better equipped, and had technology that far outstripped anything humanity had ever seen. Yet Grant didn't allow herself to focus on those facts. She couldn't afford to. The mission, the future of Earth, depended on maintaining focus. Dr. Ellis and his team had made progress, but not enough. They had managed to reverse engineer some of the alien technology, but it was slow going. It was like trying to piece together a puzzle without having all the pieces. There were many unknowns, and every discovery brought with it even more questions. The countdown to war was drawing near, and they were running out of time. Outside, the world was on edge. In every corner of the planet, people were preparing, not knowing what was coming. In some places, governments declared martial law, while in others, people gathered in quiet defiance, hoping that somehow Earth's leaders would find a solution. Some tried to flee, hoping to escape the inevitable conflict, but there was no real refuge. The Council was relentless. If they wanted to invade, they would. No place on Earth would be safe. The military's readiness was being tested daily. Soldiers drilled, practiced, and trained tirelessly. Every man and woman knew that they were preparing for the fight of their lives. There were no second chances. The Galactic Council wouldn't offer mercy, and they couldn't afford to offer any. The war that was coming would shape the future of humanity. But there were cracks in the armor. There was fear beneath the determination, and it was hard to hide. General Grant knew this. She could see it in their eyes. Even the bravest among them couldn't help but wonder, could they really win? Could they stand up to a force that had already destroyed countless civilizations? She didn't have the answers, no one did, but she would never let that fear show. She would never let them see her falter. She was their leader, and she would lead them into battle, regardless of the outcome. Ellis stood in his lab late into the night, his mind racing. The sound of keyboards clacking was the only noise in the room as he ran through calculations. He could feel the weight of the world on his shoulders. If they didn't find a way to turn the tide, humanity would be lost. The alien technology they had managed to reverse engineer was the only chance they had, but it was fragile, uncertain. Every breakthrough was met with new obstacles. The alien tech had been designed with a level of intelligence far beyond anything humanity had developed. They had only scratched the surface. He needed something more, something that could tip the scales in their favor. "Ellis, you need to sleep," one of his colleagues said, his voice cutting through the silence. But Ellis didn't respond. His eyes were glued to the screen, desperate for a solution, for a breakthrough that could save them all. But the longer he worked, the more he felt the weight of failure creeping in. It was only a matter of time before the Galactic Council would strike back. Back in the military command center, Grant was still making her rounds. The tension in the room was palpable as officers discussed the strategy for the upcoming days. Every option seemed like a long shot, and Grant could see that some of them were losing faith. She had to hold things together, but it was becoming harder and harder to keep the team motivated when every report seemed to say the same thing. The odds were stacked against them. But she refused to let that defeat her. She refused to let that defeat them. The final decision had to be made. It was time for the world to unite and face the coming storm. There was no longer any time for division. There was no more room for doubt. Humanity had to pull together or it would be destroyed. General Grant and Dr. Ellis shared a single, silent understanding. There was no choice but to fight. The battle lines were drawn. There was no turning back. The fate of Earth was sealed. As the days slipped away, the world continued to prepare. The cities were quieter now. People spent their time with loved ones, making final arrangements, trying to find peace before the unknown reached them. And in the military, there was a sense of finality in the air. They had given everything they had, and now all they could do was wait. The fleet that had been assembled was small compared to the Galactic Council's armada, but humanity's resolve was fierce. They were fighting for their homes, for their children, for their future. Before the Galactic Council's arrival, the world stood still. It was an eerie calm, as if the planet itself were holding its breath. People in every corner of the globe were watching the skies, waiting for the inevitable. The threat they had been fearing for weeks, maybe even months, was no longer something they could avoid. It was real. It was coming, and there was nothing left to do but wait. In the command center, General Grant gathered the remaining high-ranking officials. Tension was thick in the air, as if everyone present could sense that the next few hours would determine the fate of humanity. The silence was only broken by the soft hum of the monitors and the occasional shuffle of paper. There was no need for speeches or reassurances. No one was fooled by empty promises. Everyone knew that it was time for action, but the question was, would they be ready? General Grant's face was a mask of determination, but even she couldn't hide the exhaustion that had set in. Days and nights had blurred together, and the weight of the world had taken its toll. Yet she couldn't afford to show weakness. Her team needed to see a leader who believed they could win, even if it was only a glimmer of hope. "Status update?" she asked, her voice steady, betraying none of the tension she felt inside. The officers around the table exchanged glances before one of them spoke. "The fleet is in position. We've deployed all available forces to defend key locations, but General, the numbers, the odds, aren't in our favor." Grant's jaw tightened. She knew the odds. She knew they were facing an enemy with technology far superior to their own. The fleet they had gathered was small, and many of their weapons were untested. The Galactic Council wasn't just an enemy, it was an empire, a collective of species that had conquered entire star systems. To think that humanity could stand against them seemed impossible, yet here they were, preparing to do just that. "What about Ellis?" she asked, though she knew the answer. "Any breakthroughs on the tech?" One of the officers, a young lieutenant who had been working closely with Dr. Ellis, shook his head. "Not enough, General. We're still trying to reverse engineer the alien technology. It's beyond us. But Ellis insists that there's still hope. He's still pushing to integrate some of it into our weapons, but we're running out of time." Grant closed her eyes for a moment, her mind racing. Dr. Ellis had become their last hope, the one person who might hold the key to survival. If the tech worked, they might have a chance, however slim. But if it didn't, she took a deep breath. "Tell him to keep working. We can't afford to fail." Outside, the streets were eerily quiet. People who had once filled the air with the sounds of life now moved in hushed whispers, keeping their heads low and avoiding eye contact with strangers. The constant reminder of what was coming was impossible to escape. News outlets played footage of military mobilizations, the movement of spacecraft, and the darkening skies above. In some places, families gathered in their homes, holding on to each other as if the world might slip away at any moment. In other places, people had turned to religion, praying for salvation, offering up their hopes to the universe. Humanity was, for the first time in history, united by the same fear. And yet there was an undeniable resolve that burned within the hearts of many. They knew they were fighting for more than just survival. They were fighting for their legacy, for their children, and for everything they had built over centuries. They were fighting to prove that no empire, no matter how powerful, could erase the human spirit. General Grant returned to her seat at the command center. She reviewed the latest reports, but the words on the screen blurred together. The only thing that mattered now was the countdown. In a matter of hours, the Galactic Council's fleet would descend upon Earth, and the battle would begin. The lights flickered momentarily, causing the officers in the room to pause and exchange worried glances. It was a small glitch, but it was a reminder that everything was teetering on the edge. No one knew what would happen next, but one thing was certain: the next few hours would determine the fate of humanity. "All units, prepare for battle," Grant ordered, her voice steady. "This is our last chance. We either fight or we fall. There are no other options." The silence that followed her words felt heavier than any weapon could be. The reality of the situation had settled in. But even in the face of the unknown, there was something deeply human about this moment. They weren't backing down. They were ready to stand and fight, no matter the odds. As the command center sprang to life, the tension was palpable. Officers took their positions, soldiers checked their weapons, and Dr. Ellis continued his work in the lab, unaware of the passing moments. The world, in all its chaos, was on the brink of a new chapter. Whether it would be a story of triumph or tragedy was still unknown, but humanity was not going to surrender. The Galactic Council would learn, in that final moment of reckoning, that even in the face of overwhelming power, humans would never yield. They would fight to the last breath, and they would show the galaxy that Earth's people were not to be underestimated.